Madison Clark looked at the man in the worn jacket standing in the middle of the hospital lobby and let out a cold, dismissive laugh. To her, Lucas Bennett was nothing more than a struggling single father. No medical degree, no institutional authority, no business standing anywhere near the premium emergency wing. But when a VIP patient suddenly stopped breathing, and every one of the hospital's finest doctors stood completely helpless, Lucas stepped forward and asked for access to equipment no one dared touch. Madison reached for security. Then, in just a few minutes, the entire hospital went dead silent. If you believe a person's worth is never determined by appearances, stay with this story all the way through. Street Aurelia Medical Center stood at the northeast edge of the city, its glass exterior catching the pale morning light like something designed to be admired from a distance. It was the kind of hospital that published its accolades in the lobby, framed certificates and donor plaques filling the walls with the language of excellence. Patients who arrived in its premium wing were expected to match the setting well-dressed, well-connected, or at minimum, quiet and unobtrusive. Lucas Bennett was none of those things. He arrived that Tuesday morning in a faded canvas jacket, with one pocket slightly torn at the seam, his dark hair uncombed in the way of a man who had slept fewer hours than his body needed. He pushed his mother's wheelchair through the automatic doors with the practiced ease of someone who had performed the motion dozens of times and asked nothing of the world except that it step aside. Evelyn Bennett was 68 years old, sharp-eyed despite her age, with a habit of noticing everything and commenting on half of it. She had requested the appointment at Street Aurelia specifically because her cardiologist held privileges there, and because, as she told Lucas, she did not want to make a fuss at smaller clinics. Lucas had agreed without argument. He always deferred to his mother's medical preferences now. Ever since the year, he had learned how fast everything could shift. He checked them in at the front desk, located a seat in the waiting area near the window, and settled in with the quiet resignation of a man who understood that waiting was simply part of the day. The emergency wing at Street Aurelia had been renovated 18 months prior, funded by a substantial donor contribution, and the result was a corridor of clean lines, dimmed lighting, and equipment panels built into the walls with the precision of an aerospace facility. It was there that Lucas's attention caught without him meaning it to. The central oxygen monitoring panel, mounted left of the intake desk, was cycling through a warning pattern, a brief amber pulse, 3 seconds dark, amber again, at an interval that matched nothing in any diagnostic sequence he had ever learned. He watched it for 30 seconds. Then he watched it for another 30. It was subtle enough that anyone passing through would think nothing of it. It bothered him the way a fractured weld line bothers a structural engineer, even on an ordinary morning walk. Madison Clark arrived in the lobby at precisely 9:45, accompanied by 4 people in expensive suits, 2 of whom were investors from a regional healthcare fund conducting a site evaluation. She had the bearing of someone who had spent years building the impression she made when she entered a room, and Street Aurelia was the room she had constructed. The hospital was her professional biography rendered in glass and polished concrete, and she treated it accordingly. When her gaze landed on Lucas, his jacket, his folder of worn documents, his focused attention directed at the technical panel on the wall, her assessment was immediate and unkind. She murmured something to the administrator walking beside her, who nodded and adjusted direction. Lucas only noticed Madison when she had already moved into his peripheral range. He looked up briefly, registered her expression, and returned his attention to the panel. The amber light cycled once more. He stood slowly, crossed to within a few feet of the display, and studied the interval with the careful patience of someone doing arithmetic in their head. Behind him, Madison had stopped walking entirely. She watched him with the particular irritation of someone who has spotted a disruption before it has fully declared itself. He turned and addressed the intake desk in a measured, unhurried voice, the voice of an engineer describing a condition, not a person trying to draw attention. He said that the respiratory support system serving the East Emergency Bay appeared to be running a pressure oscillation synchronization error, and that it might be worth having a technician verify the secondary regulator timing before morning admissions reached their peak. Then he returned to his mother's side and sat back down, folding his hands in his lap. The room did not quite stop moving, but something shifted in the air. A young technician near the far desk looked up from his clipboard. Dr. Adrian Cole, who happened to be crossing the lobby toward the elevator, paused for half a second. Madison, however, had already decided what she was looking at. She walked toward Lucas with the deliberate composure of someone exercising restraint they feel they should not have to exercise. She told him this was a private facility and asked who had authorized him to be in this section of the lobby. Lucas explained that no one had. He was simply waiting while his mother completed her check-in. Madison looked at the folder in his hand, the worn jacket, the quality of his shoes. She told him, with no particular effort to lower her voice, that the hospital's technical systems were maintained by a certified team of professionals and that uninvited commentary from people without medical or engineering credentials was neither helpful nor welcome. She emphasized the word credentials as though it were a door she was locking with some satisfaction. Lucas did not argue. He looked at his mother, who was watching the exchange with the composed expression of someone who had witnessed this kind of thing before and trusted it to resolve itself. He turned back to Madison and said only that the issue he had described was not in the indicator light itself, but in the oscillation cycle of the pressure regulation, a distinction that suggested familiarity with the system's internal logic rather than its surface display. Then he said nothing more. Madison Clark stared at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has been handed a sentence they do not intend to translate. She told him to remain in the designated waiting area and moved on. The amber light on the panel behind her cycled again, quiet and patient, in the empty corridor. What happened next was not provoked by any new behavior from Lucas. He had returned fully to the waiting area, his attention on his mother, his posture undisturbing. It was Madison who created the scene, and she did so in front of 12 people, which was 10 more than necessary. She had been briefed by her administrator that the man near the intake panel had again been observed studying the technical display, and she had decided that the situation required a clearer resolution. She came back through the lobby with 2 members of hospital security and a confidence that belonged to someone who had never had to reconsider a first impression. She announced, in a voice calibrated to be heard without technically shouting, that an unauthorized individual had been repeatedly approaching restricted technical systems, and that the matter needed to be addressed. Several nurses stopped. A family seated near the window looked up. Lucas rose from his chair slowly and faced her without alarm. Evelyn stayed seated, watching her son with the careful stillness of someone who knew exactly what kind of weight he was carrying. Madison said that she did not know where Lucas had acquired his interest in hospital equipment, whether from a manual or a video, or simply from spending too much time in waiting rooms, but that she needed him to understand this was a facility staffed by trained professionals, not a place for untrained civilians to play at diagnosis. She asked, with the smile of someone asking a question they already consider answered, where he had studied medicine, what certifications he held, what exactly gave him the confidence to keep staring at equipment that had been installed and certified by engineers with actual qualifications. Lucas absorbed this. He did not look away from her, and he did not change his expression. Behind him, Evelyn was very still. A passing nurse had slowed near the doorway. The young technician from the far desk had drifted closer without quite committing to proximity. Dr. Adrian Cole, returning from a separate call, came to a stop in the corridor and watched. Lucas said quietly that he understood she had no reason to take his word for anything, and that he was not asking her to. He was asking her to have a qualified technician verify the secondary pressure regulator on the respiratory support unit serving the East Bay, because the oscillation timing he had observed was consistent with a valve desynchronization failure, and if that was what it was, it would not announce itself loudly. before it caused a problem. He said this without performance, without elevation of pitch, without any of the signaling that comes from someone trying to win an argument. He said it the way a person recites a checklist item they have checked off 1,000 times. Madison looked at him as though he had just recited the checklist in a foreign language. She told him that if he refused to confine himself to the designated waiting area, she would be forced to have security escort him out of the building entirely, his mother's appointment notwithstanding. She paused to let that land. Then she turned to the two security officers and gave them a brief instructional nod. Evelyn said nothing. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her son was already turning back toward his chair. And then the alarm sounded. It came from deep inside the East Emergency Wing, a sustained, three-tone alert in descending pitch that everyone in a medical facility learns to recognize before they can say what it means. Red-level event. Patient in acute distress. It cut through the lobby the way such sounds always do, rearranging every face in the room in an instant. Samuel Whitmore was 63 years old, a man whose name appeared on plaques in 4 different hospital corridors in 3 different cities, and who had been recovering in St. Aurelia's VIP recovery suite following a complex cardiac procedure performed 22 hours earlier. He was, by any measure, exactly the kind of patient this hospital had been designed to prioritize. His family had a private waiting room. His attending physician had check-in protocols that bypassed standard intake. He had been, by all accounts, stable. He was no longer stable. His oxygen saturation had dropped 14 points in under 3 minutes. The alarms were building on one another in overlapping cascades, and Dr. Adrian Cole was already running. The team that converged on Samuel Whitmore's suite in those first minutes was among the strongest St. Aurelia had to offer. Dr. Adrian Cole was a 15-year emergency medicine veteran who had trained in 2 trauma centers before taking the department head position at this hospital, and he brought with him a nurse practitioner and 2 residents who had been told on their first day that hesitation was a clinical error. They checked the airway, assessed medication levels, reviewed cardiac rhythm, examined lung pressure distribution, and adjusted ventilator parameters in a sequence that was disciplined and fast. None of it worked. The machine continued to read nominal. The patient continued to deteriorate. The ventilator showed flow rates within normal range. Oxygen concentration readings were clean. Pressure differential across the delivery circuit appeared correct on the screen. But Samuel Whitmore's body was not receiving what the screen insisted was being sent to it, and Dr. Adrian Cole knew the particular helplessness of standing in front of a machine that is telling you everything is fine, while a person in front of you proves that it is not. He called for a respiratory specialist. He ordered a chest X-ray. He had the circuit checked manually by the attending respiratory therapist, who found nothing wrong. Cole had been in emergency medicine long enough to develop a very specific vocabulary for the kind of failure that was invisible to the tools designed to find it. He had seen medication errors that the pharmacy system had cleared as correct. He had seen surgical complications that the post-operative monitoring had missed because the sensor was positioned 2 centimeters from where the problem was occurring. He had even once, early in his residency, watched a ventilator in perfect mechanical working order fail to keep a patient oxygenated because the connecting tube had a microfracture that only showed under manual pressure. The machine had read clean in every diagnostic. The patient had not. He knew the shape of this problem. He did not yet know its address. His team was running out of places to look, and Samuel Whitmore's saturation was still falling. And in the corridor outside the room, Madison Clark was watching through the glass, with the expression of someone who has identified the cost of every possible outcome and found that none of them are acceptable. Madison Clark had been notified within 90 seconds of the alarm. She arrived in the corridor outside the suite, composed on the surface and fractured underneath. Because Samuel Whitmore was not simply a patient, he was 3 weeks away from signing a capital commitment that would fund St. Aurelia's expansion into 3 new surgical suites. She stood against the wall outside the room and watched through the window with the expression of someone doing very careful arithmetic about the future. Out in the lobby, Lucas Bennett had heard the alarm from his seat. He had heard the three-tone descent and the interval, and something in him had gone very quiet, the way a frequency goes quiet when a matching frequency meets it. He stood up and walked toward the emergency corridor. Not quickly, not running, just moving with the specific directedness of someone who knows where the problem is and what shape it has. A nurse moved to intercept him. He told her calmly that he needed to get to the East Bay Respiratory Unit. The nurse told him that was restricted. He asked her to get Dr. Cole. She looked at his face and went. He could hear the machine from 12 feet away. Not the alarm, the machine itself, the breath cycle hiss and pump of the ventilator, and underneath it, almost imperceptible, an arrhythmic lag in the exhalation phase that was about 40 milliseconds off cadence. It was the kind of deviation that meant nothing to a physician, and everything to a person who had spent years learning to hear what machines do not announce. Dr. Adrian Cole came through the door with the clipped urgency of someone who has no time to waste and is spending this conversation as an investment. He told Lucas he had 30 seconds. Lucas said the problem was not respiratory in origin and not cardiac. He said the issue was mechanical, specifically that the intermediate flow regulator between the ventilator and the patient circuit was likely experiencing a check valve inversion failure, which would cause the machine to cycle oxygen correctly, according to its own sensors, while delivering a partially occluded flow to the patient. He said the data would look clean because the error was occurring at the point between where the machine measured and where the gas was actually going. He said that if the team continued trying to resolve it through pharmacological or airway adjustments, they would not find the answer, and increasing ventilator pressure to compensate would risk barotrauma to the patient's lungs. Dr. Adrian Cole was still for 2 seconds. Then he asked Lucas to come inside. Madison, who had heard this exchange from 6 feet away, stepped forward. She told Dr. Cole that he was not seriously considering allowing an uncredentialed bystander into an active resuscitation room. Her voice was controlled, but the edge beneath it was audible to everyone in the corridor. Dr. Cole looked at her for 1 moment. Then he looked at Lucas. Then he held the door. Lucas did not have the movements of a physician. He did not approach the patient, did not touch the lines, did not examine the chart. He went straight to the machine. He studied the connection housing at the junction between the primary circuit and the intermediate delivery segment, asked for a flashlight, and leaned in close to the assembly with the focused attention of a person reading a language printed very small. Then he straightened and said he needed a half-inch disconnect tool, a spare segment of corrugated flex tubing from the supply cart. And 2 minutes. Behind him, Evelyn had been brought to the hallway entrance by a nurse, who had somehow understood that she needed to be there. She watched her son from the doorway, with her hands folded in her lap, and said nothing. Madison was standing near the wall, with the expression of someone who has placed a bet they cannot take back. She had publicly humiliated this man 30 minutes ago. She had called security. She had questioned his ability to understand a warning light. And now he was standing inside her most critical patient's room, touching her most sophisticated equipment, and the most decorated physician on her staff had allowed it, and she had no mechanism left to stop what was already in motion. If Lucas was wrong, she faced consequences she could not fully calculate. If Lucas was right, she faced a different set of consequences she could not fully calculate. She pressed her back against the wall and watched. Lucas worked with a quietness that had nothing theatrical about it. He disconnected the intermediate assembly with 2 practiced motions, held it briefly toward the light from the doorway, and found what he was looking for. The check valve inside the housing had been installed in reverse orientation, creating a flow resistance that the machine's pressure sensors could not detect because the resistance was positioned downstream of the measurement point. The filter was not missing. Nothing was broken. It had simply been put back the wrong way during the most recent maintenance cycle, and the error was invisible to every diagnostic the machine was capable of running on itself. He took the flex tubing, fashioned a temporary bypass around the compromised housing, secured the connections with practiced efficiency, and told Dr. Adrian Cole to take the ventilator off automatic and switch to manual bag ventilation for a count of 8, while the circuit pressure equalized. Cole did it without hesitation. Lucas counted aloud in an even voice. On the count of 8, he said to return to automatic at the previous settings. Cole switched it back. The room was completely silent. Every person in it was looking at the same thing, the saturation monitor on Samuel Whitmore's bedside panel. The number sat at 70. 1. Then it moved. 73. 76. 79. The alarm tone dropped from sustained red to a single yellow pulse. 82. 85. Cole leaned over the patient, watched the chest rise in the new rhythm, and put 2 fingers to the wrist. He stood up slowly without turning around. Lucas had already stepped back from the machine. He was standing with his hands at his sides, watching the monitor with an expression that was not triumph. It was something quieter, the expression of someone who has done a necessary thing and now wants to go back to the waiting room. The silence in that room lasted long enough for it to become its own kind of statement. When Dr. Adrian Cole finally turned around, he looked at Lucas with the focused intensity of a man reclassifying something. He asked, quietly, who he was. Not in the administrative sense he had the intake record, but in the other sense. The sense that the question was really about the gap between what he had assumed and what he had just witnessed. Evelyn answered from the doorway before Lucas could. Her voice was steady and without drama. She said her son had been the lead development engineer on the first-generation emergency respiratory support systems for military field medicine, and that he had left the field after an accident that took his wife from him, and that he had not set foot inside a hospital in nearly 4 years until today. She said this not as a biography, but as a correction the kind a person makes when they believe the record needs to reflect what actually happened. Lucas did not look at his mother. He kept his eyes on the monitor, where Samuel Whitmore's saturation was climbing toward 91. The room absorbed what Evelyn had said, the way a room absorbs something that rearranges the furniture without moving any of it. Cole asked Lucas directly, then, to fill in the parts Evelyn had left out. Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke in the voice of someone relaying events rather than confessing them. Several years ago, he had been the engineering lead on a contract to develop portable respiratory support units for use in austere medical environments. The devices had functioned correctly. After they had been deployed, a component failure in units that had been modified post-delivery modifications, made not by his team, but by a third-party integration contractor, caused a serious incident. A medical device conglomerate had needed the liability positioned to just where specific, and Lucas had been selected for that position. He had been cleared in the subsequent investigation. But the clearing had been quiet, and the accusations had been loud. And in the time between the first and the second, he had also lost his wife to a hospital complication that had nothing to do with his work, and everything to do with why he could no longer be inside these buildings without thinking about what machines get wrong when no one is looking that closely enough. He had not returned to the industry. He had taken his daughter to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon and done consulting work that kept him far from clinical environments. He had not told anyone who he was when he had seen the pressure oscillation warning that morning. He had not wanted to be noticed. He had only wanted the warning to be heard. Cole listened to all of it without interrupting. When Lucas finished, Cole was quiet for a moment. He had spent 15 years in emergency medicine and had developed the ability to read a person's relationship to loss, not through what they said, but through the pace at which they chose to say it, the particular care they took with the parts that still carried weight. Lucas spoke about his wife the way a person speaks about a place they can no longer visit, not with bitterness, not with sentimentality, but with the precise and careful economy of someone who has learned to carry the distance without pretending it does not exist. Cole did not press for more. He simply said that he was glad Lucas had been in the building that morning, and that he understood now why he had been watching the panel. Madison Clark, who had been standing against the corridor wall throughout this, was no longer carrying the composure she had arrived with. She had heard everything. Her mind was running calculations she did not want to run, and the first of them was not about liability or press management or the investor standing 2 rooms away trying to decide what today meant for the capital commitment. The first calculation was simpler and worse. She had looked at a man and decided what he was worth in under 3 seconds. And she had been as wrong as it was possible to be. The second calculation was about the maintenance contractor. She knew the name. She had approved the contract 8 months ago because it had come in 30% under the competing bids, and because the timing of the hospital's financial review had created a pressure to find savings wherever the optics allowed. She had not personally reviewed the technical compliance checklist. She had signed the approval and moved on. She had not thought about check valves or oscillation cycles, or the downstream distance between where a sensor measures and where a gas actually goes. She had thought about the numbers in the column. Now she was standing in a corridor outside a room where one of those numbers had almost stopped breathing, and the man she had threatened with removal from the building was the reason he had not. It was Dr. Adrian Cole who found the maintenance records. He and Lucas spent 2 hours in the equipment room the following morning, pulling binders and cross-referencing installation logs against the service reports from the contractor's visits. What they found was methodical and damning in the way that institutional failures usually are. Not dramatic, not conspiratorial. Just a series of small corners cut by people who had been told, implicitly, that cutting corners in the right places was a form of efficiency. The contractor's technicians had serviced 6 units in the East Bay over the course of 3 visits. Documentation had been filed, signatures had been obtained, and the checkbox beside each service item had been marked complete. But a junior technician on the second visit, working under time pressure to clear the bay before VIP admissions began, had reassembled the intermediate flow regulator housing on Unit 4 in reverse. He had done it quickly. He had not noticed. He had filed the report. No one had reviewed the work against the original specifications because the hospital's own quality assurance process had been suspended during the renovation transition and had not been formally reinstated. A hospital technician named Derek Moss had submitted 3 internal maintenance flags over the preceding 6 weeks, noting anomalous readings on the East Bay units. 2 of them had been returned with a notation that the issue was within acceptable variance. The third had not received a response. Derek had been 22 years old and in his first year of employment, and he had not escalated, because his supervisor had already told him once that the VIP wing's launch timeline was not something that accommodated equipment holds. Lucas read Derek's flagging notes carefully. The language was tentative, the language of a young person who does not yet trust their own perception, who hedges every technical observation with qualifiers because they have not yet been given permission to be certain. But the readings were accurate. Every anomalous data point Derek had flagged was a real deviation. He had been seeing the same thing Lucas had seen in 30 seconds. And he had been seeing it for 6 weeks, and the system had taught him to doubt himself instead of the equipment. Lucas set the notes aside and said nothing for a long moment. Cole watched him. They both understood that what was sitting on the table in front of them was not primarily a maintenance failure. It was the record of what happens when the people closest to a problem are systematically discouraged from trusting what they can plainly see. Lucas and Cole sat across from each other in the equipment room with this spread between them. Lucas was not angry in the way people perform anger. He was quiet in the particular way of someone who has seen this shape before, who knows that the line between a near miss and a tragedy is not competence but luck, and that institutions tend to learn this only after the luck runs out. Madison Clark called the board meeting herself. She did it the same afternoon, before any external communication had gone out, and she sat at the head of the table with the maintenance records in front of her, and told the board what had happened in a sequence that left out nothing. She had been briefed by legal counsel, who had suggested several framings that would have distributed the narrative more evenly across the contractor, the maintenance timeline, and the renovation transition. She did not use any of those framings. She said that she had approved a cost-saving contract without adequate technical oversight. That internal safety flags had been suppressed under schedule pressure she had created, and that a patient had nearly died as a result. She said this in a voice that was not performing contrition and was not performing composure. It was the voice of someone who has run out of performances and is simply speaking. The board voted to commission a full system audit of all life support and respiratory equipment in the hospital. They voted to suspend VIP wing operations until the audit was complete. They voted to establish a standing equipment safety review protocol with a direct reporting line to the chief medical officer, bypassing administrative approval for any maintenance halt. Lucas had not attended the board meeting. He had been in the family waiting area with Evelyn, who was reading a magazine with the serenity of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that the world's most important moments rarely announce themselves. Lucas had submitted his findings to Cole in a 12-page technical brief that identified the root cause, the 6 other units at potential risk, and a recommended inspection protocol with testing procedures. He had not included his name on the title page. Cole had added it before submitting it to the board. When Madison found Lucas the following afternoon, in the same waiting area where she had humiliated him 2 days before she came without an entourage and without the posture of someone conducting business, she came with the particular quietness of someone who has had to think very carefully about what they owe another person. She apologized. She said that she had made assumptions about him based on things that had nothing to do with who he was, and that those assumptions had nearly cost a man his life, and that she was sorry. She said it, looking at him directly, without the hedged language of institutional liability. It was not a polished apology. It stumbled in the middle. She paused once and pressed her lips together and started again. Lucas listened. Evelyn watched from her chair with the expression of someone deciding whether a thing is real or performed. Lucas let the silence hold for a moment after Madison finished. Then he said that he accepted the apology. He said that he believed she meant it. But he also said that the respect she was showing him now should not have required a demonstration of expertise to arrive at, that it should have been present from the moment he walked through the door, as it should be for anyone who walks through that door. Because the person in the worn jacket, waiting with their mother, is not a lower order of human being than the person in the funded medical chair, and a hospital that operates as though they are, is not safe for either of them. Madison did not look away from him. She did not argue. She nodded once, and it was a different kind of nod from any she had used in the 2 days prior. Not the nod of a person managing a situation, but the nod of a person marking something down in a place they intend to carry. Samuel Whitmore had been told the full account on the second morning after the incident, when he was alert enough to receive it. His wife had been present. His attending physician had given him the clinical summary, and then, at Samuel's request, had given him the human summary who had been in the room, what had been said in the corridor, and what the man in the worn jacket had found in the intermediate housing assembly that every other person in the building had missed. Samuel had asked to speak with Lucas directly. Lucas had declined, but had sent a message through Cole, saying only that he was glad Samuel was recovering, and that the audit would find whatever else needed finding. Samuel had then called his financial advisor and delayed the capital commitment signing by 3 weeks, not canceled, delayed, with a new condition attached, that any future major gift agreement include an independent equipment safety audit clause tied to the first disbursement. His attorney had drafted the language. Street, Aurelia's development office had agreed without negotiating. Dr. Adrian Cole came to the waiting area 2 days before Evelyn's discharge to ask Lucas a question that he had been sitting with for some time. He said the hospital needed someone who understood equipment systems at the level Lucas understood them, not as a physician, not as an administrator, but as a safety engineer, someone whose job was to hear what the machines were saying before the alarms did. He said it with the directness of a man who has identified what he needs and is not going to dress it up. He asked Lucas if he would consider a consulting position. Part-time, structured around his schedule, focused on equipment, risk assessment, and incident protocol development. Lucas was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands. He looked at his mother, who was reading again, or pretending to. He had been in this building for 4 days and had not once passed through its doors without feeling the weight of everything he had walked away from, not just the career, but the version of himself that had believed the work was worth the cost, before the cost had become something he could no longer afford to pay. Evelyn was the one who spoke into the silence. She said simply that not coming back had not kept him from bringing what he carried everywhere he went anyway, and that a person's history does not wait at the door of the places that remind them of it. She said that whatever he had lost in this industry, he had not lost the thing that mattered. And she tilted her head very slightly toward the corridor where, 2 days ago, a monitor had climbed from 71 to 91. While a room stood still, Lucas agreed to a trial period. He set one condition. He said that any safety flag raised by any member of the hospital's technical or clinical staff, regardless of seniority, regardless of timeline pressure, regardless of whether the concern came from a credentialed physician or a 22-year-old technician in his first year, had to receive a documented response within 24 hours. No exceptions, no variance windows, no administrative deferrals. Cole agreed without hesitation. Madison, who had been listening from just outside the waiting room doorway, said nothing, but nodded once toward the hallway and walked away. 6 weeks later, Street Aurelia had completed its full equipment audit. 11 units across 3 departments had been flagged for corrective maintenance, 2 of which had shown fault patterns similar to the one that had nearly killed Samuel Whitmore. All 11 had been serviced and recertified. Derek Moss, the 22-year-old technician whose safety flags had gone unanswered, had been given a formal commendation by the new Patient Safety Committee and a direct line to the Chief Medical Officer for future reports. He kept it on his desk. Madison Clark had changed in ways that were visible to people who had known her before. She still walked the hospital with purpose, but the quality of the purpose was different. Less about arriving somewhere, and more about seeing clearly what was already there. She stopped spending the first 45 minutes of her daily rounds in the executive corridor, and started spending them on the floors, in the waiting areas, in the corridors where the people who actually kept the building running were working. She listened more than she spoke. It was not a transformation. It was an adjustment, made slowly, and without announcement, of the angle at which she had been looking at things for a very long time. On a Thursday morning in early autumn, Lucas brought Evelyn to Street Aurelia for her 3-month cardiac follow-up. The appointment was routine. The cardiologist was pleased. Evelyn told the attending nurse that her blood pressure had been excellent and attributed this to her son finally finding somewhere useful to put himself, a statement she delivered with the serenity of someone who had been waiting a long time to say it and found the waiting worthwhile. The nurse wrote it in the notes as a positive psychosocial indicator. Evelyn would have found this description satisfying. As they passed back through the lobby on the way out, Lucas glanced at the monitoring panel on the left wall, the one he had watched cycle amber and dark on the morning all of this had started. It was running clean, steady green, no variance, no lag in the timing cycle. A young technician was running a routine check on the panel's calibration display, and when he saw Lucas looking, he straightened slightly and nodded with the specific quality of respect that does not require the person giving it to know every detail of why it is owed. Lucas nodded back. He pushed his mother's wheelchair through the automatic doors and out into the cool morning air, and the doors closed behind them without ceremony. He had never needed anyone to know his name. He had never needed the room to go quiet when he walked in, or the right people to speak first, or the acknowledgement to arrive in the form he thought he deserved. He had needed only one thing, the same thing he had needed on every project and in every building where a machine's failure had the power to end a life, for someone to listen when the signal was still small, before the alarm made it impossible to ignore. He had not always been heard. But today, the panel was green, and somewhere behind him, inside those walls, a 22-year-old technician had a direct line to the top of the building and had been told, in writing, that his voice was worth answering. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole point. The work of safety is not done in the dramatic moments. It is done in the quiet ones, in the 30-second intervals when someone pauses and looks at a thing that is almost wrong and decides that almost is close enough to warrant the trouble of saying so. Lucas Bennett had made that choice twice in the same building. Once when no one was listening, and once when everyone was. He had made it the same way both times. That was the thing about doing the right thing. It did not change its shape depending on who was in the room.